You are about to witness the very exciting story of a city and its people. It is a story of a city seeking new horizons in a resolute contest with great challenges. That city is Detroit.
It was a long drive from Georgia to Detroit, but Shirley Patterson didn't mind. He was excited to go and visit his old friends, the Adamses, a couple he had known for years but hadn't seen for a while. They had recently rented a place up in Detroit, and Shirley was very keen to come and see it. Weirdly, when he spoke to them about it, they seemed a little colder than usual, like they weren't super excited about him coming up to them for a few days. But he thought they hadn't been in their new home for too long. Well, it had been nearly a year, but it takes time to settle sometimes, and the Adamses had plenty of children to keep them busy. They were likely tired, stressed. A visit from good old Shirley would do them some good, he thought to himself, as he drove along the streets of Detroit, the leaves falling around the pavements, as autumn was fully here. Bill and Lillian Adams greeted Shirley after he pulled onto their driveway. Bill rushed to grab his friend's suitcase as Shirley looked up at the house. It was a simple grey frame house, a little small maybe for them and the kids, but it looked nice, Shirley thought. Lillian showed Shirley around and then took him through the kitchen to a small dark room at the back of the property. Despite the house not being that large, this room felt removed from the rest, tucked right back. It had a built-in wardrobe and was big enough to fit a bed, but that was about it. Shirley smiled at Lillian. "So, this will be my room then," he said. Lillian told him to get himself settled in. But he could tell something was off about Bill and Lillian. They didn't seem like their normal selves, and he couldn't put his finger on why. Bill Adams worked the midnight shift at the local Cadillac plant, so around 11:30 that night he headed off to work. It had been a long day, and Shirley said goodnight to Lillian before retiring to the guest room to get some much needed sleep. Shirley climbed into bed and rolled over to face the wall. He said it felt like he had only been laying there for a few minutes, but he could have easily fallen asleep with how tired he was. Suddenly, he felt someone grab him from behind, pulling on his side and flipping him over onto his back with such a sudden force it caused Shirley to jump up, terrified. At first he thought it was one of the kids messing around, but the strength. He didn't have long to play it over in his mind. There was no one else on his bed. No one that could have pulled him round like that. But he wasn't alone. He was glancing around the darkened room, trying to figure out what had just happened, when he noticed the door to the bedroom was open. There was someone standing there in the kitchen. There were still lights on throughout the house, so it was being backlit by the kitchen light, creating just a darkened outline initially. It was a woman. "Lillian? What are you doing?" Shirley called out. She had her back to him and didn't respond. Shirley called out again, but that's when his eyes began to adjust, and he slowly realised this didn't look like Lillian. He felt a shiver run down his spine as he began to process what he was looking at. The woman still had her back to him, but he began to notice she had longer hair than his friends. She also appeared to be wearing a short fur coat, and a blue dress was poking out to the bottom of it. Still, the figure didn't turn. It just looked outwards into the kitchen. Shirley didn't question why this person had flipped him over, why she was ignoring him. His mind jumped straight to anger. There was an intruder in his friend's house. Shirley shouted. The woman ignored him. He jumped out of bed and rushed towards her, screaming as loud as he could, seemingly in an effort to scare this woman away. But she didn't move, didn't react. He quickly took the few short steps from the bed to the doorway, but just as he was about to reach out for her, the kitchen light went out. In fact, every light in the house seemed to switch off simultaneously. Shirley Patterson was now unable to see, and this woman was there in the darkness with him. Shirley didn't know it at the time, but his friends had been using him as an unwitting test subject. Something was very wrong with that bedroom, something they couldn't explain. It's time to get yourself a warm drink, dim the lights and get comfortable. I've got a chilling little paranormal case from the 1960s to share with you all. Something that, while ingrained in the local folklore of Detroit, seemingly isn't really spoken about too often in the wider world. This is the case of the horrible hag of Detroit. Welcome to the Tape Library. If you enjoy tales of the paranormal and the unexplained, I'm here every couple of weeks discussing famous cases. First we hear the stories, then we try to lay out what may have really happened. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future stories. Now, let's get into tonight's case. In the early 1960s, Detroit was at a crossroads. The city was still known as the motor capital of the world, a global symbol of manufacturing power, a place where factory shifts dictated daily life, and thousands of families relied on the automotive industry to survive. Radios were just beginning to carry the sounds of Motown. Assembly lines ran day and night, but many middle-class families were beginning to flee for the suburbs, leaving the rhythm of working-class life to shape the character of entire communities. Detroit was also entering a period of tension and transition. Economic pressure was growing, social unrest was building. Beneath the surface of productivity and progress, many residents felt an unspoken sense of uncertainty, the feeling that the city was approaching a turning point. And that darkness just bubbling underneath the surface can be seen echoed in the city's many ghost stories and mysteries. Of course, some existed long before this period of time, and stuck around long after. But when viewed through this lens, it is interesting. Our ghost stories really do represent the worlds we grow up in. One of Detroit's oldest supernatural legends is the Nain Rouge, a small, grotesque, goblin-like figure whose sightings are said to foretell misfortune. While it didn't appear in any writings until the 1800s, the legend apparently dates back to the early 1700s, when Detroit's founder, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, reportedly encountered the creature. According to later retellings, a fortune teller had told Cadillac to appease the small red creature, but instead, Cadillac struck the being with his cane after it appeared before him, an act that some believed cursed both the man and the settlement that he governed. Over time, the Nain Rouge became linked in folklore to a series of calamities in Detroit's history, including fires, civil unrest, economic hardship, and the city's long decline. Descriptions of the creature vary, but it's commonly portrayed as short, red-skinned, impish and deformed, sometimes with glowing eyes and sharp teeth. Rather than behaving like a ghost, the Nain Rouge is typically framed as a malicious or trickster spirit, appearing briefly before vanishing. Meanwhile, standing on Woodward Avenue, there is the Whitney Mansion, now operating as the Whitney Restaurant. But unknown to many of its diners, it is one of Detroit's most well-known haunted historic buildings. Built in 1894 by wealthy lumber baron David Whitney Jr., the mansion has long been associated with reports of paranormal activity. Over the years, staff members and visitors have described unexplained footsteps, doors opening or closing on their own, cold spots, flickering lights, and that familiar sensation of being watched. Some witnesses claim to have seen apparitions, often described as a woman in period clothing, believed in local lore to be tied to the Whitney family or the mansion's early occupants. There have been UFO sightings, haunted lighthouses, pubs. Michigan as a whole feels overcome with a strange uncanniness running through its streets. But for tonight's case, we're going to be looking at a rather personal account. A case that took place over a relatively short span of time, reported by an ordinary working class family, documented in local newspapers, and centred on a small rental home on Martin Street. The house was perfect for what they needed. Sure, it was a little snug for Bill, his wife Lillian, their 5 young children and a small terrier dog, but it was a home, and one that was close enough to Bill's work at the Cadillac plant. We have to wonder, if Bill didn't work nights, if the family would have realised something was wrong so quickly. The back room was small and dark. Just off from the kitchen, it felt totally separated from the rest of the house. So Lillian didn't want any of the children to have it. They would instead share the other bedrooms in the property. But Bill saw a use for this room. He had worked the night shift for years, but still he would often struggle to sleep during the day, and he was always worried about disturbing his family when he came home in the early hours of the morning. So he thought this was the perfect place for him to get some sleep on occasion, away from everyone else. Bill would stumble in and crawl into bed for a few hours to get some decent sleep, before he'd have to get up and be a dad again. But while having the separate room helped Bill fall asleep quickly, something was clearly playing on his mind, because Bill began to have nightmares. But these weren't just any nightmares. They were vivid, terrifying. The sort of dreams that would stay with Bill for hours after he woke up. They felt so real. Bill had never experienced anything like this before. On occasion he would jolt up in bed, and Lillian would come running, due to his piercing screams echoing around the house. But Bill wouldn't stop screaming when his wife came in. He would continue until his throat gave out, and he would come to his senses. Bill never seemed to want to talk about what was happening in his dreams, but he did briefly mention one where he found himself opening a door, only for a mutilated body to fall out, crashing to the floor next to him. The dreams got worse and worse. Bill couldn't sleep anymore. He would want to, but it was like his brain was fighting against it, trying to protect him from that world that lay just beyond consciousness. It grew so bad, Bill considered talking to a psychiatrist. He was very quickly unravelling. But then one day, he came back from the plant, glanced into the small dark room and decided against it. Instead, he crept into the master bedroom and laid down next to his wife. Bill fell asleep instantly. He didn't have a nightmare. The next day again, he slept in the main bedroom and was fine. Maybe it was just the comfort of being next to his wife. Maybe it was the change in environment. Bill didn't care what the reason was. He was just relieved to be free of the nightmares. Over time, Bill realised he only seemed to have the bad dreams when he slept in the back room. Bill and Lillian had ties back down south in Georgia. That was still where most of their friends and family were, so they didn't see them often. But in August of 1962, around 9 months after they had moved in, Bill's grandmother came to stay for the weekend. They set up the back room as a guest room, and she was happy to see the children after so long. After a long day together, everyone headed off to bed. Bill's grandmother wouldn't get any sleep that night. Every time she began to drift off, she was convinced that someone was making a noise in the room. At first, she couldn't quite figure out what was going on. Was it something outside the window? But after hearing it repeatedly, she began to realise it was the door. The door was shut, but it sounded like someone was trying to get in. Initially thinking it was the kids messing about, she went and opened the door, but there was no one there. As soon as she got into bed, it began again. The following morning, Bill came down to find his grandmother sitting at the kitchen table. She was shaking, her skin pale, eyes black. Bill asked her what was wrong. She told him there were terrible sounds in that room, that all night long she was kept awake. She was convinced that someone was trying to break into her room, but there was no one there. She couldn't explain it, she just said that she never wanted to sleep in that room ever again. She tried to shake off the events of that night, trying to reassure herself that there was a logical explanation, but she couldn't. She felt so uneasy she began the trip back to Georgia later that day, having only stayed for a single night. It was at this point that Bill and Lillian really started to put things together. It wasn't just Bill's dreams anymore. They hadn't said anything to their grandmother about that, and yet she felt uncomfortable in that room too. But it wasn't just her either. They then began to realise that the kids would run around the entire house playing, but they would never go into that back room. They had never been told not to, and none of them had ever raised any concerns about the room. It was like they just naturally avoided it. The dog too, normally always happy to follow Bill around, wouldn't step foot into that room. These small details had gone unnoticed until now, but this had all been the case since they moved in. 2 months later, their friend, although in some versions of this story he's referred to as a cousin, Shirley Patterson, came to visit. We obviously began with Shirley's encounter at the start of tonight's episode, but I didn't give you the full story. What Shirley didn't know was that Bill and Lillian were using him effectively as a test subject. Bill was described as a no-nonsense southern gentleman. He had a very practical, matter-of-fact way of thinking, and wouldn't be spooked easily if there was something that made people uneasy in that room. Bill and Lillian decided that if it happened to Shirley too, then maybe there really was something wrong with their home. Shirley was quoted in a later article confirming he didn't know anything about the room. He had no reason to be afraid. He was simply visiting his friends and spending a bit of time in Detroit. As we've already heard, Bill left for work that night and Shirley retreated to bed. Very soon after laying his head on his pillow, he felt himself being pulled over, practically turned around, seemingly by an invisible presence. But that didn't mean he was alone as such, because standing just several feet away in the doorway of the room was a woman in a fur coat, with her back to him. Bill obviously assumed it was Lillian at first, but when he suddenly realised it wasn't, he knew there was an intruder in the house and jumped up to confront the strange woman. He screamed loudly and charged towards her, before all the lights suddenly switched off, plunging Shirley into darkness. He stumbled about in the darkened kitchen, terrified, when suddenly the lights came back on. He was there, alone. He ran back to his room. There was no one in there. He rushed around the house, moving quietly so as not to disturb the children. No one. There was no woman. He went back to the kitchen and sat down, shaken by what had happened. All the commotion had caused Lillian to come out and see what was going on. Shirley looked terrified. Lillian had never seen the man like this before. Even before he spoke, she knew that something had happened with the room. Shirley opened his mouth and said, "I saw," but before he could get another word out, a sound came from somewhere else. It was like a wail. They later described it as something between a person screaming and an animal howl. This mournful, wailing groan. Both of them froze, looking around trying to figure out where it had come from. That's when they realised. It sounded like it came from the back bedroom. The bedroom door was open. They could see into it. There was no one there. They glanced back at each other, speechless. Then the smell came. Both of them reported an overwhelming smell that made them retch and gag. Shirley stood up and walked towards the bedroom. It seemed clear the smell was originating from there, but he couldn't figure out what was causing it. The bedroom barely had anything in it. But as quickly as the smell would come, it faded away. That's when they heard a new sound. A banging. It was coming from the utility room. The pair walked into the room and both saw it. There was a trapdoor in the utility room that led down to a partially dug out basement area. The door was heavy and left closed to stop the children from getting in. But the trapdoor was raising itself up several inches before crashing back down into place again, as if someone was trying to get in. That was when they called the police. The police turned up and searched the entire property, from the attic down to the basement, and they found nothing. There was not even a sign that someone had attempted to break in, nor anything that could explain the things that Lillian and Shirley had claimed to see. Bill Adams returned home that morning to find his wife and friends still awake, waiting up for him. They laid out the whole story of what had happened that night, but Bill couldn't accept it. Sure, he'd had nightmares. Sure, he felt uneasy in that room, but this was a whole other level. Were they suggesting this was a ghost? Bill couldn't believe that. He was quoted as saying, "I am a grown man with a family. I've been in the army. I just couldn't convince myself there was anything to it." Bill hadn't slept in the back room in months at this point, but after Shirley's story he decided he had no choice but to confront this phenomena himself, to see if there was any truth to it, to see if he could figure out what was really going on. That night at about 7:30 p.m, Bill went to the back bedroom and laid in the bed. The children had been sent to bed. Lillian and Shirley sat in the living room in nervous silence, waiting to see if anything would happen. Bill laid there, facing the wall just as Shirley had. He was there for a while, unable to sleep, but not feeling anything unusual, when he suddenly heard his wife in the room. Bill whispered to her that she needed to leave him alone to do this, that he didn't think this thing would show up if they were both in there. As soon as he spoke, Lillian, or at least who he thought was Lillian, stopped moving. The room was silent. He didn't hear her leave. It was like she just stopped moving. Slightly annoyed, Bill turned around to see what his wife was doing. There, right next to the bed, just inches away from him, was a face. A twisted, grotesque face of a woman who hadn't been in our world for quite some time. Bill said it was like her eyes stared past him, like it was looking in his direction but maybe not at him exactly. But that is when its mouth began to move, as though it were about to talk. All that came out was a hissing noise and a horrible, foul stench. To call it fear would do a disservice to Bill's reaction to seeing this. He jumped out of bed, screaming, running out of the room as fast as he could. Lillian and Shirley came rushing out to the kitchen to find Bill wailing like a madman, pulling chunks of his hair out. What he had seen was impossible. What he had seen was indescribable. It sent the man into a bout of temporary madness. Shirley tried to grab Bill to stop him from hurting himself, but Bill, so overwhelmed with adrenaline, easily forced his way out of the larger man's grip and began flailing his arms at Shirley. Lillian grabbed a blanket from the living room and along with Shirley threw it over Bill and wrestled him to the floor, pinning him down until his senses came back. As they held him down, they noticed it again. The smell. The smell from last night was back. After some time of calming down and then searching the house yet again to be sure no one had got in, Bill told Shirley and Lillian exactly what he saw. He didn't know what it was exactly, but he knew they couldn't stay there. 1 hour later, the house on Martin Street was empty. They had grabbed the children from their beds and fled to Lillian's parents in Dearborn. They never wanted to go back to that house again. They had paid their rent for the following month already, but the Adamses gave their notice and quickly found a new house to rent, only returning for their belongings during the day and with the company of friends and family. But some of those family members were intrigued. Before their lease ended, Lillian's brother Leo begged his sister to let him go and see the room for himself. She said if that's what he really wanted, she would lend him the keys, but she would not go back there with him. Instead, Leo brought along his other sister, Virginia. Leo and Virginia arrived at the house on Martin Street one night in November. The pair were sitting in the kitchen when Leo said to his sister that he was going to go into the back bedroom, turn off the lights, and lay there for 10 minutes to see if anything would happen. Virginia, the slightly more nervous of the pair, was happy to let her brother go and have his silly fun, so she waited in the kitchen. A few moments passed and Virginia heard what she described as an awful groan coming from the back room. Her first instinct was that Leo was messing with her, but the sound was weird. She couldn't quite explain it, but something about it made her question if her brother was even capable of making such a sound. She didn't have too long to mull that question over in her mind though. Leo came running out of the back room, grabbed his sister by the arm and said they needed to leave. The look on Leo's face made Virginia instantly know he wasn't messing about. They quickly left the house. Leo wouldn't tell Virginia what he saw in the back room, what had made him so terrified. In fact, he refused to talk about it with anyone. The Adamses were gone from the house on Martin Street now, but their story was starting to do the rounds in the local area. A number of people contacted the landlady, asking if they could conduct investigations in the property, but she refused, not letting anyone in and wanting to kill off this ghost story as quickly as she could so she could get some new tenants in. The Adamses didn't experience anything unusual in their new home, and according to most write-ups you can find on this case online, neither did any of the new residents in that house on Martin Street. But that isn't completely accurate. In 1973, 10 years after the Adamses had fled the home in the middle of the night, the Detroit Free Press published a follow-up article on the haunting. They interviewed the current occupant of the home, a woman named Grace Willis. I'm unsure how long Grace had been living in the property at this time. She said she found the whole idea of the haunting ridiculous and hadn't experienced anything strange. But as the reporter spoke with her further, Grace did reveal two interesting bits of information. There had been one day when she was sitting in the living room with her sister-in-law, when they heard what they described as the cascade of breaking dishes crashing to the floor. They rushed into the kitchen, both convinced that one of the cupboards must have collapsed. But when they entered the kitchen, there was nothing wrong, and no obvious source for what could have created such a distinctive sound. But still, Grace didn't believe the place was haunted. In fact, she knew there was nothing wrong with the back bedroom, because ever since she had moved in, she had been sleeping in there. But it was a strange detail she hadn't considered until talking about it with the reporter. She could only ever fall asleep if she laid on her side, facing the wall, away from the door. Her mind wouldn't rest if she looked towards that bedroom door. So what really happened? The story was picked up by the Detroit Free Press shortly after the Adamses made their escape, and the report split the local community. Some thought the family were simply looking for attention. Others claimed that the family had a falling out with their landlady and had invented the haunting story to get back at her. But it's worth noting the time this took place. While it's not out of the question, being this was the early 1960s, it does fit into a time in history before the real boom of paranormal haunted house claimants that took place throughout the 1970s, before slowly beginning to die off in the late 1980s. This was a time when the paranormal became a huge focal point in popular culture, and the amount of people claiming to have been living in a haunted house was huge, especially off the back of the whole Amityville story. That's not to suggest that false claims of the paranormal didn't happen before the 1970s. Of course they did. But it was certainly a slightly more unusual story at the time than we maybe would see it as now. Others believed that the family really were scared away, but that it was the work of people, not ghouls. That someone had been getting into their basement and messing with them. Of course, this doesn't really explain what Shirley and Bill both see, but maybe this heightened sense of fear caused both men to imagine things. It's worth noting that the initial reporting of this story seemingly took place just a week after the family left their house, and included interviews with a number of the people involved. So this doesn't feel like one of those cases where faded memories, leading to exaggerations, could be blamed for the details. This is another case where it doesn't appear the people involved really gained anything from their story, beyond a small amount of attention at the time. It seems like Bill and his family told their story to the reporter that one time, and then just moved on with their lives, disappearing off and leaving behind this strange little paranormal story for people like me and writers such as Brad Steger, who I relied on heavily for this episode, to obsess over for decades to come. They even left the property with a month's rent paid up in advance. So if this were a hoax, they effectively lost money to pull it off. Could they have just made it up? Of course. But I like to try and give people the benefit of the doubt in stories like this. So what else could it have been if not a hoax? Well, the old familiar environmental factors could be at play here, a gas leak being the more obvious one. Most of the phenomena is segregated to one area of the house. It starts out with a feeling of unease and paranoia, but escalates over time. The more vivid moments that could be hallucinations are accompanied by a strong smell. There is also the fact that the landlady wouldn't let anyone investigate the property. Was this due to her not wanting to entertain the idea of ghosts? Or was she trying to cover up a potentially dangerous home environment before her next tenants moved in? Bill only sees the hag after Shirley claims to have seen a woman in the house. Did Shirley's sighting play on Bill's mind and influence his hallucinations on that last night? But if this were the case, it's interesting that it is Shirley who suffers the most vivid hallucinations, at least up until that point, within just a few moments of being in the room. But Bill was the one who was sleeping in that room for weeks, if not months. And if their story is accurate, both Lillian and Shirley witnessed the moving basement trapdoor and groans coming from the bedroom together, suggesting that, at the very least, could not be a simple hallucination. So, what if this truly were paranormal? It's interesting how here, as in so many similar cases, the phenomena grows stronger the more that attention is paid to it. Bill was having nightmares and feeling uneasy, but he only saw the apparition when he was at a point where he wanted to face it head on. The various visitors to the house that experienced stuff didn't know about the apparent haunting, but Lillian and Bill were becoming increasingly aware of it, and the more it plays on their minds, the more vividly the activity appears for others as well. I'm so curious to know if there was truly no further activity after the family left. We obviously hear a few little details from the resident in the 1970s, but if the landlady was trying her hardest to keep this story quiet, I'm curious if there are other stories that just haven't come to light. I wonder how many other residents of the home left soon after renting the place out. It appears the house is still standing today, although how much of it is the original property and how much has been completely redone is unclear. There is something to me about this story that, if we take it at face value, I find genuinely chilling. But it's not the experiences of any of the people in the story that bother me. It's the entity that is now commonly referred to as the horrible hag of Detroit. While the interactions with her seem to terrify the people around her, the entity itself never really seems to do anything cruel. Bill has terrible dreams. He sees a body in at least one of them. They hear her make sounds. The grandmother is convinced that someone is trying to come into the room. Someone is trying to get out of the basement. On that final night, she opens her mouth, apparently to try and speak, but all that escapes her lips is a hiss. Sure, tales of demonic hauntings are terrifying in their own way, or the chaos of a poltergeist infestation, but a case like this really gets to me. Because what if the hag, as they call her, isn't some malevolent presence? What if she is trapped in our world, desperately trying to communicate with the people in this reality that she once called home? But no matter how hard she tries, she just can't. All she creates is fear, trapped in her own personal hell, unable to call out for help. It makes you wonder, whose body was Bill dreaming about? And if that basement under the trapdoor is only partially dug, what could be buried in the ground? That's all for this entry into the tape library. Every episode I do on a haunted house, I'll always get at least one comment asking why the people didn't move out instantly, so it's quite refreshing to find a case where this basically happened. Again, I think this was another story that was requested by one of you lot, so if you did bring this to my attention, thank you. As always, I want to hear your thoughts and theories on this case in the comments below, so let me know what you think happened here. I know I don't always get to reply to everyone, but I read almost every comment at the very least, and I massively enjoy the conversations around these topics. Time to wrap up for another night. Of course, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on the next one. If you want to help me out with just a couple of quick clicks, you can like this video if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're listening to the podcast, then leave me a 5-star rating. I know it gets boring hearing this every episode, but it does massively help me to reach people on these platforms. If you ever want to support the show and get a few little perks in return, you can do that through Patreon or YouTube memberships. Again, I'm a little unsure where we're going with the next episode. I've got a few different possibilities. But I'll be back next week with another episode of Night Drive Paranormal. So if you want more creepy stories from me, be sure to check that out as well. Until next time, my friends, pleasant dreams. This episode was made possible from the kind donations of members on Patreon and YouTube. First up, our tape library archivists, Adam Grantham, Yenok, Aurora, Lee Borix Johnson, Now and Zen, Pat McShay, Pantherpaw, The elusive M yoinks in away the bisexual moon cult, emulated Phoenix, Jamie Long, Lisa Mary Sheridan, Gaffy with a G, Plum Blossom, Gina Britton, Emily Carlin, Sarah Boyd, Thomas Boatwright, Stephen Lutman, Crystal E, West Virginia Vegetable Man, Dawn Swan, Tina S, Sean Miller, Juno, Joseph Corderla, Jolly Jedi, Pixelina, Joe, The Crimson DM, The Detective, Jean Janine, Darla, Alfredo Sandoval, G-Raw, Lydia Zabine, Dominic DeAngelis, Dagon O'Doorleg, Judith Hacker, Eric Salas, Mirashard, Adlin, Ash Loves Books, Tracy Torello, Gabrielle, Umiko Grimm and Sandy Lusk. Then we have our amazing lead archivists. Darren Morgan Green, Wynne Lewis, Plague Doctor is in, Amy Stubblefield, The Original Deer, Emmy Bartley, Lady Vet Noir, Ridiculous, London Grace, Melissa Harrison, Emperor Franz, Old Soul Like Mine, Xavier Angle, Sad Girl Callie, Alex O'Neill, Tyler Michael, Alex Goldberg, Van Yole, Brian Baker, and 1000th Ghost, and our insanely generous Grand Overseers, Harrison the Yoga Lord, Leah Carmella, Bad Diddley, Katie, Morning Rain 2619, Agent 355, and the one you'll stick around to hear, Queen of Flatulence. A serious massive thank you to all of those people for being just a lovely bunch, and all my junior archivists on Patreon and you wonderful members on YouTube. You guys all keep the lights on in the Tape Library archives. If you want to join us, then please check out the Patreon link in the description. Thank you.